At 58, Natalie had long accepted the quiet rhythm of her life. For years, she had lived alone, a choice she made after her divorce at 43. At first, the silence had been deafening, the empty house echoing the absence of her once shared life. But over time, she had learned to live with it, even grow comfortable in it. She had found a sense of peace in her solitude, an unexpected refuge that no longer felt like a punishment, but rather a source of strength. She'd become accustomed to her routine, the small rituals that filled her days with a quiet sense of purpose. Each morning, she would brew her coffee and sit in the same chair by the window, watching the world outside stir to life. The scent of freshly ground beans would linger in the air, grounding her in the simple pleasure of the moment. There was something deeply soothing in the predictability of her life, something that allowed her to regain control over the things she had once lost. With each passing year, her world had shrunk, not out of fear, but out of choice. She had stopped searching for excitement or adventure, no longer yearning for the things she thought she needed. There was a comfort in knowing what each day would bring, a peace that came from embracing the quiet corners of her world. But even in her contentment, there were moments, fleeting but sharp, when the loneliness crept in. It wasn't overwhelming, and it wasn't constant, but it was real. There were nights when the stillness of her home felt like a weight on her chest, when she would catch herself staring at the empty seat across from her at the dinner table. The silence between her and the empty chair, heavy with unspoken words. She had learned to live with these moments, to accept them as part of her life. It wasn't ideal, but it was the life she had built, and she had grown to accept its limitations. What Natalie didn't realize was that even in the quiet, life had a way of changing without warning. She had become so accustomed to this solitary existence, to living without expectation, that she had stopped wondering what could be different. The idea of a deep connection, of something unexpected shaking up her routine, seemed like a distant, almost impossible thought. She had long since stopped looking for it. She believed that her story was written, that the chapters of her life were complete. But sometimes, life has a way of surprising you, quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the most ordinary of moments. And it was in this quiet life, one that Natalie thought she had mastered, that she would find her world unexpectedly and profoundly changed. But not yet, not until a simple decision, a small purchase, would open the door to something she never imagined. It was an ordinary day when Natalie decided that her old coffee maker, which had faithfully served her for years, was no longer working. She had relied on it for her morning ritual, a moment of solitude that marked the beginning of her day. It was a small thing, but the thought of replacing it stirred something within her. Perhaps it was the quiet realization that even the smallest of her routines was slowly eroding with time. After all, the machine had been with her through so many mornings, each cup a quiet companion to her thoughts. But now, it had become obsolete. She knew she needed a new one, but as she walked into the store, she wasn't expecting anything more than just a simple purchase. It was a mundane task, one that hardly seemed worth thinking about. Yet, it was there, in the midst of this ordinary errand, that she met him. Ethan, a young man no more than 24 or 25, with an energy so different from her own quiet, measured existence. He greeted her with a smile that felt almost out of place in her world of muted colors and predictable patterns. There was an eagerness in him that reminded her of a life she had long since put behind her, a life filled with spontaneity, curiosity, and a sense of adventure. At first, it was just a conversation about coffee makers, a simple exchange of facts and details. But as the conversation continued, something shifted. Ethan didn't just talk about the machines. He asked about her preferences, about the small details of her life that she had stopped sharing with anyone. In his questions, Natalie heard a curiosity she hadn't realized she missed, a desire to know her beyond the surface, to understand the subtleties of her existence. It was a simple thing, this genuine interest, but it left an impression on her. For years, She had kept her thoughts and emotions tucked away, afraid of burdening others with the weight of her solitude. But here was someone who didn't shy away from her quiet life, who seemed to find something worth exploring in her small, measured world. As the conversation continued, he made an offer that seemed innocent enough at the time. He would deliver the coffee maker to her home. It wasn't a big gesture, nothing extraordinary, but as she considered it, something about his tone, the way he looked at her as if nothing about her life was too mundane to be worthy of his attention, made her feel strangely seen. The offer was simple, but it felt like an invitation. An invitation not just to receive a coffee maker, but to open the door to a moment of connection that had been missing from her life for so long. It was as if Ethan, in his youth and eagerness, had unknowingly reminded her of a time in her life when the world had felt full of possibility. The decision to let him come over wasn't just about the coffee maker anymore. It was a decision to allow herself to be seen, to let someone into the quiet space she had carefully crafted for herself. And though it was small, the decision marked the beginning of something new, a shift that would change her, whether she realized it at the time or not. When Ethan arrived at Natalie's house, it felt like an intrusion, though she couldn't quite pinpoint why. The doorbell echoed through the stillness of her home, and as she opened it, she found herself facing a young man who was, in some strange way, both familiar and foreign. Ethan's presence seemed to fill the space around him, bringing a warmth that was unfamiliar to her usually quiet, solitary home. The small, almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere caught her off guard, making her aware of the subtle walls she had built over the years. Walls she hadn't realized were so high. As he stepped into the house, Natalie noticed how effortlessly he moved through her world. The same world she had meticulously curated to keep others out. Her home, which had once been a sanctuary of solitude, now seemed to carry an unfamiliar energy. She hadn't expected the encounter to stir such feelings. The personal items scattered on the couch, little remnants of her life, old clothes, books, and a few unassuming mementos, suddenly seemed like loud declarations of her private world. It wasn't that she was ashamed of them. In fact, they were her, the little things that made her who she was. But in this moment, she realized how vulnerable she was, how easily she had hidden herself away behind these carefully constructed walls. As Ethan's eyes flickered over the room, Natalie's heart skipped a beat. The impulse to hide, to pretend that these small fragments of her life didn't exist, washed over her. She felt her cheeks flush, her thoughts rushing in a scramble to cover the mess, to brush it all aside. But then, as if reading her thoughts, Ethan spoke. His words, simple and nonchalant, were not what she expected. It's completely natural to have these things when you live alone. We all have needs, don't we? It was a comment so casual, so devoid of judgment, that it instantly disarmed her. She had expected something different, perhaps a look of discomfort or awkwardness, maybe even a quiet dismissal of her mess. Instead, Ethan's words opened a door she hadn't even known was closed. He didn't judge her. He didn't recoil at her imperfections. He simply acknowledged that they were a part of her, part of the quiet life she had built. And in doing so, he gave her something she hadn't realized she needed. Permission to let go of the shame she had long carried about her solitude, about the small messes and unspoken vulnerabilities that were a part of who she was. Something shifted between them in that moment, something intangible but real. There was a quiet acceptance in Ethan's eyes, a calm understanding that made Natalie feel seen in a way she hadn't been in years. For the first time in so long, she wasn't hiding. She wasn't pretending to be something she wasn't. She was simply herself, in the presence of someone who didn't just tolerate her, but seemed to genuinely appreciate who she was, messes and all. The awkwardness that had initially filled the space between them began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet, almost unspoken connection. It wasn't just about the coffee maker anymore. It wasn't about the small, everyday interactions that defined the moment. It was about the recognition of something deeper, something more meaningful, the possibility of a connection that transcended the superficial, and reached into the heart of who they both were. And in that space, something beautiful began to take root. As the afternoon wore on, Natalie and Ethan continued to talk. What had started as a simple exchange about a coffee maker evolved into something entirely unexpected. Something deeper, something that stirred parts of her she had long forgotten. At first, she tried to keep the conversation light, to maintain her usual guarded distance. After all, she had learned to guard herself, to keep her emotions tucked away, safely hidden from the world. But Ethan's presence seemed to have an uncanny way of breaking down the walls she had so carefully built around her heart. His words, though simple, were infused with a quiet warmth that made her feel something she hadn't felt in years, connected. Ethan wasn't just talking to her, he was listening, truly listening, in a way that made her feel understood. It wasn't just idle conversation, it was a conversation that held meaning, that acknowledged her as more than just a woman living alone. He asked questions, not out of mere politeness, but because he wanted to know her, about her life, her thoughts, the things that made her who she was. There was no judgment in his curiosity, no impatience for her answers. It was as though the very act of talking with him made her feel seen in a way that she had almost forgotten was possible. For years, Natalie had carried her thoughts alone. She had built a life around her solitude, creating a world where she didn't have to explain herself, where no one would challenge her choices. But here was Ethan, a stranger just hours ago, who made her feel as if her inner world was worthy of exploration. His curiosity wasn't invasive, it was gentle, respectful, and it left her feeling strangely at ease. He didn't rush her, didn't push for more than she was willing to give. But with every word he spoke, with every question he asked, she felt a subtle shift inside her. A realization that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't meant to navigate life entirely on her own. It was a strange feeling, one she hadn't anticipated. There had been moments of loneliness in her life, moments when she had longed for someone to share her thoughts with, to simply be there without judgment. But she had buried those feelings beneath the surface, convincing herself that she didn't need anyone, that she was fine on her own. Ethan, without even trying, had peeled back the layers she had so carefully constructed. He had made her feel safe, not just physically, but emotionally. In his presence, she didn't have to hide. She could be vulnerable without fear of being judged. The more they talked, the more Natalie began to realize how much she had missed this, the simple act of being truly heard. She had spent so many years carrying her own burden, so many years thinking that she had to be strong, independent, and self-sufficient. But Ethan had shown her that it was okay to let go, to let someone else see the parts of herself that had remained hidden for so long. And in that realization, something inside her stirred, a longing for a connection she had long denied. She wasn't just craving companionship, she was craving the kind of connection that allowed her to be fully herself, without pretense, without masks. And in this moment, with Ethan, she felt as though that kind of connection was finally within reach. As Natalie excused herself to change, she felt a strange urge wash over her. It was as though something in the air had shifted, something unspoken but undeniably present. She hadn't planned on it, but as she ascended the stairs to her bedroom, the need to alter her appearance, to somehow step into something new, became undeniable. She wasn't sure what it was exactly, but it felt like a moment of transformation. She stood in front of her closet, hesitating for a moment, before picking out a dress that she hadn't worn in ages. It was simple, yet it felt different somehow, a reflection of a side of her she had forgotten, a side that longed for connection, for something more than just the predictable solitude she had grown accustomed to. She slipped into the dress, the fabric hugging her figure in a way that felt oddly reassuring. It wasn't a drastic change, but it was a change nonetheless, an acknowledgement that she was no longer the same person she had been when she first opened the door to Ethan. Something had shifted inside her, and she felt the pull to embrace that shift, to step into it fully. She wasn't just putting on a dress, she was allowing herself to be seen, allowing herself to step outside the boundaries she had so carefully built around her heart. As she descended the stairs and re-entered the living room, she immediately noticed a change in the atmosphere. The air between her and Ethan felt charged, as if it had thickened with something neither of them had quite articulated. His gaze met hers, and for the first time she felt as though he wasn't just looking at her, but truly seeing her. There was a depth in his eyes, a soft intensity that she hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just about her appearance. It was as though he was noticing her in a way that went beyond the physical. It was a recognition, a silent acknowledgement of the shift that had taken place, both in her and in their connection. A wave of nervous energy swept over Natalie, but it wasn't the kind of anxiety she usually felt when venturing into unknown territory. It was a different kind of nervousness, one filled with excitement, anticipation, and yes, a little bit of fear. It was the kind of feeling that comes when you're standing on the edge of something significant, something that could change everything, and you aren't sure whether to take the leap or hold back, but in that moment there was no holding back. The pull between them was undeniable, the space between them shrinking with every passing second. She found herself standing before him, her breath catching in her chest. Without thinking, she spoke, her voice light but carrying an edge of curiosity. "So, do you have a girlfriend, or do you spend your nights alone like I do?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, a playful jab that somehow felt more vulnerable than she intended. But as soon as the words left her lips, she realized how much they had revealed, how much she had unknowingly opened up to him. Ethan's reaction was subtle but profound. His eyes softened, and a small smile tugged at the corners of his lips. It wasn't just the polite smile she had seen earlier. This one was different. It was a smile that spoke volumes, a smile that told her he recognized the vulnerability in her question, the unspoken desire for connection that lay beneath her words. In that moment, she knew they were both feeling the same thing, the undeniable attraction, the magnetic pull that seemed to draw them closer despite the barriers that had once kept them apart. There was no hesitation now, no more pretending. The unspoken bond between them had grown too strong to ignore, and Natalie felt herself moving toward him without thinking. The space between them had all but disappeared, and what remained was a raw, vulnerable connection that neither of them could deny. And as she took the next step, she realized that this moment, this shift, was not just about physical attraction. It was about the quiet recognition that something profound was unfolding between them, something that would alter the course of her life in ways she couldn't yet understand. But for the first time in a long while, she was ready to embrace it, to let go of the past and step into something new, something full of possibility. The moment they shared was unlike anything Natalie had ever experienced. There was an intensity to it, a weight that made her heart race with a mixture of excitement and fear. As she stood there, closer to Ethan than she had ever been, everything seemed to slow down. The world outside her home faded, and all that mattered was the space between them, the unspoken understanding that had been building ever since he had stepped through the door. As she led him toward the bedroom, she felt a strange sense of inevitability, as though this was where they were always meant to be. There was no hesitation, no doubt in her movements. Each step she took felt like a natural progression, as if the distance between them was shrinking, drawing them together in a way neither could resist. The usual walls she had so carefully built around her heart seemed to vanish, replaced by a feeling that she had been waiting for this moment, this connection, without even realizing it. When they entered the bedroom, everything shifted again. The room, usually a private space, now felt charged with a kind of electricity. The air between them seemed heavier, laden with emotions they both struggled to put into words. There was nervousness, certainly, but there was also an undeniable pull, a magnetic force that drew them together with a quiet urgency. For the first time in years, Natalie felt truly alive, fully present in the moment, free from the constraints of her past and her carefully constructed solitude. Ethan's eyes met hers, and in that gaze, she saw something that took her breath away, something raw and unspoken. He wasn't just seeing her in the physical sense, he was seeing her in a way that went beyond appearances. His eyes were filled with an intensity that reflected the deep connection they were sharing, a connection neither of them had expected, but both were now ready to embrace. There was a softness in his expression, a tenderness that made her feel vulnerable, but safe, exposed but protected. In that moment, it was as if they had both stripped away the layers that had kept them apart, revealing the truth of who they were. Flawed, imperfect, but human. When their lips met, it wasn't like any kiss she had ever experienced before. It wasn't rushed or frantic. Instead, it was slow, deliberate, and filled with a quiet passion that spoke of everything they had both been holding back. It was a kiss that held the weight of their shared history, their unspoken fears, and their desire for something more. As their lips met again, the world outside their bubble seemed to vanish entirely. There was no past, no future. There was only the present, and in that moment, it was perfect. As they pulled away, the silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but rather a peaceful recognition of what had just transpired. They lay side by side, their bodies pressed together, and the stillness of the room felt almost sacred. It was as if they had both found something they hadn't even known they were searching for. Natalie's breath slowed, her heart still racing, but there was a sense of calm that settled over her. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. In Ethan's presence, she felt seen, understood, and accepted, just as she was. And in that moment, Natalie realized that life had a way of surprising her, of leading her to places she hadn't expected. She had spent so many years closed off, convinced that she didn't need anyone. But now, with Ethan beside her, she knew that sometimes the most profound connections come when you least expect them, when you let go of your fears and embrace what the universe has to offer. As the silence enveloped them, a quiet peace settled between Natalie and Ethan. The world outside felt distant, as though it no longer existed, and in this small, intimate space, time itself seemed to stretch and slow. There was no need for words, no need for explanations, just the soft rhythm of their breathing and the shared understanding that something profound had happened between them. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Natalie wasn't alone with her thoughts. She wasn't hiding behind walls she had so carefully constructed. In Ethan's presence, she felt free, liberated from the isolation she had long accepted as part of her life. His arm was draped over her, a gesture that should have felt possessive, but instead felt comforting, a promise of safety and connection. It wasn't about possession. It was about the simple act of being present, of sharing a space in a way that made her feel whole again. It was the quiet acknowledgement that sometimes the most profound changes happen in moments of stillness, when you stop chasing after something, when you stop overthinking and allow yourself to simply exist in the moment. Natalie had spent so many years believing that she could only find peace in her solitude, that the world outside could never offer her the connection she craved. She had convinced herself that she was better off alone, that the wounds from her past were too deep to let anyone in. But here, in the presence of someone who had entered her life so unexpectedly, she began to understand the profound truth she had been denying for so long. Sometimes, the most beautiful moments come when you stop controlling every detail, when you stop searching for answers, and allow yourself to embrace the unknown. Ethan's whispered words broke the stillness, but they didn't disrupt the peace between them. "I've never felt so calm before," he said softly, as though speaking to himself more than to her. His voice was filled with sincerity, with a quiet awe at the connection they had just shared. And in that moment, Natalie knew exactly what he meant. She had spent so many years seeking calmness in solitude, convincing herself that her own company was all she needed. But now she realized that calmness didn't come from isolation. It came from vulnerability, from allowing someone else in, from connecting with another person in a way that felt both natural and transformative. "I feel the same," she whispered, her voice low but steady. The words came from a place deep inside her, a place that had been locked away for years, hidden beneath layers of self-protection and fear. She had never imagined that a simple, unexpected connection could create such a profound shift in her. She had never imagined that letting go of control, letting someone else into her life could bring about such peace. But in this moment she understood life had a way of surprising her, of showing her that the best things often come when you least expect them. As she rested her head against Ethan's chest, the quiet rhythm of his heartbeat grounding her, Natalie realized that sometimes the most meaningful moments are the ones that happen when you stop trying to orchestrate every detail. Life wasn't about waiting for the perfect moment. It was about embracing the unexpected, the beautiful chaos that came when you opened yourself up to possibility. And in that moment, with Ethan beside her, she finally understood that the best things in life often find you when you let go of the search. She didn't need to chase happiness or connection anymore. It had found her. As Natalie lay beside Ethan, the stillness between them spoke volumes, echoing the quiet realization that life often has a way of surprising us in the most unexpected ways. She had spent years in solitude, convinced that her independence and control over her own life were all she needed. But in that quiet moment, surrounded by vulnerability and connection, she discovered that life's most profound moments rarely arrive when we're seeking them out. Often, they come when we stop trying to control every aspect of our lives and simply allow ourselves to be open to what the universe has in store for us. This story teaches us the importance of embracing vulnerability. We often hide parts of ourselves out of fear of judgment or rejection, but true connections, the ones that enrich our lives, are formed when we let go of the fear of being seen and allow others to witness the imperfect, beautiful parts of ourselves. Natalie's journey reveals that sometimes the greatest gifts come when we stop expecting perfection and learn to embrace the messiness of life. It's a reminder that we don't have to be strong all the time, that letting someone else in can offer us a deeper sense of peace and understanding. We all long for connection, but sometimes we must first be willing to step out of our comfort zones and let go of our defenses. Natalie's story shows us that the unexpected can bring joy and fulfillment, and that embracing change, even the scary, uncertain moments, can lead to the most rewarding experiences of our lives. If you've found inspiration in this story and would like to continue hearing more lessons about life, love, and growth, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support motivates us to keep creating meaningful content that touches lives and encourages change. Don't miss out on the next video. It could be the one that inspires your next big step forward.